Hello everyone and thank you for being here. My name's Charlene and this is the first video of my brand new YouTube channel. I will be vlogging about all things cozy, so it will be books, cozy gaming, things I like to do to be cozy, just anything cozy basically. Thanks for being here. So when I was thinking about what my first video should be, I thought predominantly I want to focus on books a lot, and where better to start than to take you through the books I've read so far in 2024. Just to let you know as well, just straight from the start, that I am not the quickest reader in the world. I'm not going to be one of these booktubers that you watch that read like 7 books in a week. I've got a full-time job and I just love reading. It's like my passion and one of my favourite pastimes, so I will be taking you through a realistic what I read. And there will also be spoilers, so don't say I didn't tell you. So like I said, I'll be going through the books I've read so far this year and also letting you know what I scored them out of 5. Starting with Holly by Stephen King. This was, I'm kind of ashamed to say, my first Stephen King book I've ever read. And I read this because my husband bought it, because my husband is a Stephen King fanatic. So when he read Holly, he was like, I absolutely love it. I feel like you'll love it too, because my genre, well, up until the beginning of this year, my genre that I tended to stick to was like thriller and crime. So he was like, I think this is like a bit weird and that you'll like it. So this was my first book of the year. Just to kind of very, very quickly and briefly explain the plot, like I said, spoiler alert, this is about a older couple who basically you find out pretty quickly on in this book that they are actually cannibals. And yep, I said that right, cannibals. They have some health conditions and they are trying to overcome those health conditions because they're also like science professors and academics. I do read, I promise. And so they are trying to figure out a solution to their health conditions, and they figure out that that is surely to eat people, right? So that's what they do. I'm not going to go into too much depth about it because I don't want to give it away entirely, but basically the book goes through lots and lots of various storylines of missing people and how they end up in the hands of this murderous cannibal couple. I scored this 4 out of 5, and it was not for, you know, the point knocked off wasn't for any other reason other than I didn't know when I first started reading this that this is actually the 3rd book in a trilogy, and it is obviously pretty stupid to jump right into the 3rd book without reading the first 2. So there were a few things, a few storylines that I didn't actually know what they were referring to because they were referring to the previous books and the characters within those books. But even if you haven't read those other books, the story alone like stands, and it was so enjoyable. It was creepy, it was fun, it was a real page turner for me, and I absolutely loved it. So yes, Stephen King Holly was my first book of the year and I rated that a 4 out of 5. So the second book I read this year was Lemon by Kwon, Yeo-Sun, and I'm so sorry if my pronunciation of that is completely wrong, and I obviously read this on my Kindle. Yeah, this was something really different for me to read. I mean, on the face of it, it is a kind of crime mystery thriller book, but the writing itself and the story itself was something completely different to what I'm used to, and I absolutely loved Lemon. So just again to keep things brief because I don't want to give away too much, but there will be a few spoilers. So this is the story of a beautiful, popular girl that is killed, and then there are 2 main suspects for her crime, but for one reason or another, alibis and things like that, nobody gets held accountable for her murder, and so the case goes cold and moves on, and the story picks up 17 years later. I think it's 17 years later, but a long time later, when her sister is trying to investigate her murder and her killer and to try and get to the bottom of who committed this crime. So on the face of it, this book is a whodunit, and I should, by the way, say it's quite a short book. I think it's around 150 pages, so you can read this quite quickly, even me, and I'm a really slow reader. I think I read this in a couple of nights. Yeah, it is a whodunit, but really that's not the point of the book. That's not the most important part of the book. Really, the book is exploring grief and how we move on after people die, and what you know, the people who are left, what life looks like for them, how they move on, how they deal with their grief. It's a really heart-wrenching story of the story is told from two different perspectives. So you see it from the younger sister of the girl that died and from one of her classmates, and the dialogue switches between the two people. So you see the story unfolds between these two people's perspectives, and you meet a lot of the characters along the way as well, the people who are involved in the potential murder, and their families and friends, and just all of the people that they left behind. So it's a really different book. I mean, I feel like that is by no means enough explanation, because it's such a beautifully written kind of, it's almost in parts poetic. It has this really kind of like dream-like, to me anyway, it had this like really like dream-like quality about it, and it was easy to read. It was light, but it was also dark. It was funny in places, but it was also very heavy, and it was just really, really interesting. Like I said, it was something like I've never read before. So this book, I can't decide between a 3.5 and a 4, and I know that's really stupid because there's not much in it, but I absolutely love the book and I probably would read it again. But I did get lost at a few points along the way as well, because like I said, the story's being told from the perspective of two different people, and it switches between them. But I got a little bit lost at points along the way because it's told in the first person from both sides. So sometimes I got a bit confused about like who's saying what and whose experiences were whose and things like that. But the book as a whole, I absolutely loved. I really enjoyed reading it. So I would say either a 3.5 or a 4. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that and be so unsure, but I would definitely recommend reading this book. Okay, so the third book I read this year, I couldn't escape it, was Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This book, the hype around this book is insane. Like, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. And so, of course, I got swayed and I had to read it. I read it on my Kindle. And this is, by the way, I'm not intending on giving fully like comprehensive reviews of each book. I'm just giving you a quick rundown and my scores of what I've read so far this year. So Fourth Wing, very, 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 very briefly, because this is a really in-depth story where a lot happens. But basically it follows the story of our main character called Violet Sorrengail. So Violet is going into an academy where her mum is one of the head members. I think she's a part of a military role or something like that, but she's very high up and influential in this academy. Violet wants to be in, there are various quadrants within this academy, and Violet wants to be in the scribe quadrant, which is very quiet and bookish and, you know, writing and things like that. But through various different circumstances, and mainly because of her mum, she's kind of forced into the Riders quadrant, which is insanely dangerous. I don't know what mum on earth would rather that she go there than here, but anyway, the beginning parts of this book really reminded me of Hunger Games with the trials, because to even get into the academy to begin with, you've got to go through a series of really intense tasks and you know, it really dangerous, life-threatening things that you've got to go through. Violet, spoiler alert, makes it through, and basically this follows the story of her and you know, her friends going through the Riders quadrant, and the end goal is that they get bonded to a dragon, which, again, spoiler alert, Violet does ×2. She also has an old friend at the academy looking out for her called Dane, but I don't know if we can actually say when we find out in the end what Dane's been up to, that he was actually looking out for her. And Xaden, who comes across in the first place as like a really awful bad guy, but of course they end up kind of, it's like a enemies to lovers kind of story. And there were parts of this book that I loved, and there were parts of this book that I wasn't sure about. And I know that people are not gonna like me saying that, because people absolutely love this book, and I can completely see why. In my head, it's like a mashup between Hunger Games, a bit of Harry Potter. It's a fantasy book, and And it is really interesting. For me, like, all of the challenges and all of the kind of bonding to the dragons and all of that was like, I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. I was just sitting up for hours reading. But then when it got to the point where there was this obvious sexual tension between Violet and Xaden, it just got a bit too obvious for me. And I know some people love a slightly spicy story, and that's fine. Like, if you love that, great. I'm not taking anything away from that, but just for me, it was like a few of the lines were a little bit cheesy, and the story was a little bit obvious with the kind of, like I said, the haters to lovers thing. Yeah, I don't know. There were parts of it I loved, parts of it that I didn't like so much. I loved the dragons. The two dragons that Violet gets bonded to are just absolutely amazing. And obviously this is going to be a film. There's like no two ways about it, and I can't wait to see that. I would definitely still go see it. But yeah, for me it was good, but not. Maybe because of the hype, I was expecting something that absolutely blew my brains. I don't know. But for me, I kind of settled on a 3 out of 5. And I don't know if that's a bit harsh or not. And please don't come for me, because I know people absolutely love this. But it didn't make me go on to read Iron Flame, which is the next book in the series. I did like it. There were parts of it I didn't like. Also, I didn't particularly want Violet. Like, usually when you're reading a book, you're rooting for the main character, and Violet to me was just a little bit annoying, a little bit cocky and obnoxious, and I don't know, I didn't really want her that well. So yeah, that's what I thought. That's where I landed, was a 3 out of 5. Like, it was good, but not brilliant for me, and I wouldn't be in a rush to read it again. Okay, so the 4th book I read this year was The Guilty Couple by C.L. Taylor. C.L. Taylor is actually one of my authors that any book that I see that they've written, I tend to just grab it because I know it's going to be good. This is, generally speaking, this is my favourite kind of area, like the thrillers, crime books. But I wasn't loving this book. Let me just read the blurb to you. So it says, 5 years ago, Olivia Sutherland was convicted of plotting to murder her husband. Now she's finally free. Olivia has 3 goals: repair her relationship with her daughter, clear her name, and bring down her husband, the man who framed her. Just how far is she willing to go to get what she wants, and how far will her husband go to stop her? Because his lies run deeper than Olivia could ever have imagined, and this time it's not her freedom that's in jeopardy, but her life. So this book was, I don't know how many pages it is. It is like around 330. I enjoyed the story as a whole. Like I said, I love a thriller. I love a crime book. And the story was kind of interesting. As soon as she gets out of, Olivia's gone to jail. That's where the story starts. And when she gets out, she's on a mission to clear her name. And like the blurb explained, that includes a lot to do with her husband and the very deep, dark web of lies he has woven. But I don't know, like, there was something about the story that was just like a little bit off for me. Like, it just felt a little bit obvious. I feel really awful saying that because I really like C.L. Taylor and I like this genre a lot, but there was just something about it that I was just like, it's okay. So yeah, it wasn't my favourite, but it was like there were lots of twists and turns, lots of interesting characters, lots of the women that she spent time in jail with, are her friends helping to clear her name, and she's trying to re-establish a connection with her daughter, which, as I can imagine, would be extremely difficult, especially with a husband that's feeding her lots of lies and who is absolutely horrendously awful himself. And the things that happened to the main character, I really felt for her for, because it made me think of my mum and what she would do to establish a connection with me, and that she would do everything this mum did to, try and reach back out to her daughter. Like a mother's love is like nothing else. And to think about what the character's going through and associate that with my mum and what she would do, I really felt for the main character. But again, the story just didn't quite hit for me, and so I think I'm landing on giving this a 3 out of 5. And the 5th book I read this year was Diary of a Void by Yagi, and I absolutely loved this book. very briefly, the story is about the main character Shibata, and she works in an office in Japan, and she is basically one of the only women in her workplace in an office environment, which is predominantly men. And she is completely at the end of her tether with how they treat her. They just expect her to do, you know, everything around the office. They expect her to clean up after them all the time. They just treat her like the general dog's body, basically. She's just sick of it. And so one day they ask her to do something, a task which she finds disgusting, and she just basically says, no, sorry, I can't do that. I'm pregnant. And just like that, she falls pregnant. And then this story follows Shibata's journey of pretending that she's pregnant. And I guess this book is like the absolute pinnacle of fake it till you make it. Basically, the story follows her, and the chapters are the weeks of her pregnancy. And her pregnancy, but basically it follows her through her story of, you know, getting the perks of being pregnant, like leaving work early and the things that she enjoys about it. But then also it explores a lot of like themes of loneliness, a lot to do with feminism as well, and how society expects us to be, what they want us to do with our lives, and you know, that there are different paths for different people. I found this book so interesting. It was really funny. Like it's so well written. In places it's really funny, in places it's really sad, and it just made me really think about gender roles in society, and it made me think a lot about what's expected of women, how they're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, you know what I mean? Like if you want to have a child, then there's so much that comes along with that, and what's expected of you, and you know, if you're a woman who doesn't want a child, like what people think of you. And I don't know, I'm blathering, but you know what I mean? Like it really goes into depth and explores all of those themes of women, of society, of norms, what's expected of people, of loneliness. It was so interesting. I thought this book was great, but I did get a little bit confused because basically she's clearly faking being pregnant the whole way through, and then at the end she just has a baby. So I'm like, it doesn't go into how she got pregnant, like whether she was actually pregnant the whole way through or what. So that I'm a little bit confused about that. But yeah, that was the story as a whole, and there was a really lovely quote in it. That there were a few points in this book that for some reason I would just be reading it like normally, and then a sentence or a quote would happen and it really hit home to me. And one of them that was, I've got it on my computer just here, it said, I just hope you managed to live your life the way you wanted, to take naps when you felt like it, to know yourself by a name that made sense to you. And that for some reason really struck me and hit home to me. I'd never heard anything said quite like that before, and I just really thought that quote was really lovely and really beautiful. And this book as a whole, it's just quite a short book as well. It's 213 pages, quite a quick book that you can read in like a weekend, or if you're a very fast reader, maybe even in the day. But for someone like me, not so much. I really enjoyed this book. I'll probably read it again at some point, but for me this was a 4 out of 5. The only reason it's not a 5 out of 5 was because, like I said, I was a little bit confused as to it, like, is she actually pregnant or not? I don't understand. But I loved this. I loved pretty much everything about it, and I would highly recommend. Okay, so the next book I read this year was Billy Summers by Stephen King, and I did not read this version. I read it on my Kindle, but my husband bought me this afterwards because I loved it so much. Just straight up, I'm going to say that this was my first 5 out of 5 book of the year. It was, I know people probably don't think it's that big of a book, but for a slow reader like myself, it is quite a big book. It's like 432 pages, which for someone like myself who reads quite slowly is a big book. But I love this book so much. I loved everything about it. I actually picked this up because after reading Holly and really liking Stephen King's writing style, I wanted to read another Stephen King book, but I didn't want to read one that was like a horror, because, you know, like I want to sleep. And if I read too many horrors, like it just really gets inside my head. So I was looking up Stephen King books that weren't like horrors as such, and this one was recommended, and I'm so glad it was recommended because I read it and I absolutely loved it. This follows the story of a man Billy Summers, who is a hitman, and he has had a very long and I guess you could say successful career as being a hitman, and he's pretty much done, you know, he's pretty much you know, wanting to retire, but then a job comes his way for an extremely high amount of money that he absolutely can't turn down, and so he's umming and ahhing about taking the job, and in the end decides to take it because it is worth such a high amount of money. But from the beginning things don't seem quite straightforward. There's a lot of question marks about who's actually, you know, ordered this hit, this job, the reasons why. There seems to be lots of people involved which Billy isn't used to, and the story basically follows him following through with that hit, and obviously it's his last hit, so you know everything's going to go wrong, and it does. Everything goes wrong after this, and it is just, he's basically been set up, and the high amount of money that was promised to him was never going to come his way, really. So yeah, after that happens, he meets a girl, and I won't go into too much detail, but they basically become like a Bonnie and Clyde situation, and I loved this book so much. It goes into a lot of background about the characters. It goes into a lot of background about Billy, his story, and this was actually the first book. I know it might sound really random, but the story follows what happens after this hit and happens to them, and follows their story. And in the end, it was an ending that I wasn't expecting. And I think this is the first book that's ever actually made me cry, which sounds really random because it's Billy Summers, but I did. I cried when it ended, and I'm not going to say why, because although I've kind of explained a little bit, I don't want it to be a complete like dead giveaway of the book. But I absolutely loved it. That was a really rubbish, like, not very in-depth review of the story. Obviously, I don't want to give too much away. But I would highly recommend this, whether you like Stephen King normally or not. If you do, obviously go for it. If you're not a horror reader, still go for it, because it's just the most interesting story. I will absolutely read this again and again. Thank you to my lovely husband who bought me this collector's edition of the book. It is absolutely beautiful, and yeah, I couldn't recommend this more. 5 out of 5. The next book I read was The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix, and I loved this book. This was my second 5 out of 5 book of the year, and I absolutely loved it. After reading Billy Summers, which is quite a heavy, you know, in-depth book, it felt like this was a bit of a palate cleanser. This felt really easy to read, really light. The story isn't that light, to be honest. It's a horror story, but it was so fascinating, so interesting, and I know this shouldn't have anything to do with it, but I absolutely love the cover of this book. I just think it's so cool. Yeah, this actually, my husband bought this for me because we both love reading. And so we decided to buy each other every now and then a little mystery book that we thought each other would like. And he bought me this one, and it was a bit of a wild card for him, he said, but I absolutely loved it. So the story is set in 1993, and it follows the main character, Patricia, and she is living in a suburban world, which reminds me very much of like the kind of Stepford Wives kind of world, you know. She's a bit lonely. She's got 2 children and a husband, but the husband is very much like a workaholic, not around much, and so she meets like a few other women who are in kind of similar situations to her. Maybe they're single parents, or maybe they're with, you know, husbands who aren't around much, whatever, and they start a book club, which to me was so fascinating because it's like Inception kind of, you know, like reading a book where somebody's going into a book club talking about the books that they've read, and the books that they're reading and that they're interested in are all of the stuff that I'm interested in. So they read Helter Skelter, and they read you know, about Ted Bundy, and you know, all of these like things to me that are really fascinating. And yes, and then Patricia meets a new person who moves into her town, a neighbour called James Harris, and she quickly discovers that everything is not right with James Harris. She gets a bit too familiar, a bit too quick, and then really regrets what she's done, because without giving everything away, it basically comes to light that James Harris is in fact a vampire. And so the story follows what is happening in the town where they live. Lots of children going missing. Patricia knows the reason why, but she's struggling to make people believe her, and she has a real struggle. At one point she gets hospitalized. People think she's absolutely crazy, but she basically with her friends, there's so much that's popping into my head that I want to tell you about the story, because I just thought it was so good and so interesting, but I don't want to give every detail away. But what I would say is this was a easy read. It was interesting, it was fun, there were funny parts, there were horror parts. I just thought it was so cool. I absolutely loved it. I would give this 5 out of 5 and highly recommend. Okay, so the next book I read was The List by Yomi Adegoke, and this is another one of those books that was crazy viral all over TikTok and Instagram and BookTube and everything. So this book is basically the story of a power couple. They're a power couple on social media. They're called Ola and Michael. Ola works for a women's magazine, but she's been a women's feminist journalist and kind of figurehead for feminism for a long time, and she's really made a name for herself in that world. And Michael is a podcast host, and they're basically a power couple. Everybody loves them and watches their every move on social media and follows them, and then they're engaged to be married. They're about a month away from getting married when all of a sudden a list comes out on Twitter, and it is a list of names of men who are in positions of power or in the media who are basically accused of being groomers, abusers, people who have done sexual assault. Basically everybody on this list is done something really horrendous, and Michael's name is on that list. And so the story then follows of what does Ola do. She's engaged to be married to this man that she loves, but she's also in a position where she, it stands up for feminism and women's rights, and she doesn't quite, she can't quite think of the man that she knows and is going to marry as the same man on this list and what he's been accused of. So the story basically follows what happens between them, why his name is on that list, who put him on the list, and what happens to them as a couple in the end. And it's a really rocky road for them. It's not straightforward at all. I don't think anybody would really know what to do in that situation, but this book was really interesting because it felt so modern and relevant, probably more than anything else I've ever read before. It explores issues of cancel culture, social media, what happens when we kind of put these people that we're following on social media on such a pedestal and kind of turning them into icons and idols. It talks about sexism, racism, feminism. It's very hard hitting, it's very current, and I really enjoyed those aspects of it. But for me, there were also parts of it that I didn't quite follow, or maybe some of the language was to me a bit I don't know, the dialogue felt at times a little bit forced and things like that. But I did enjoy this book as a whole, and I can completely understand why it's got so much hype around it, and I think it is quite an important book as well. For me, I'd probably give this overall a 3 out of 5. The next book I read is The Witching Tide by Margaret Meyer, and I loved this book so much. This is basically, as the title would suggest, the story of witches and witch trials in 1645, and this is actually based on a real story. I did read, I think it's somewhere in England, I can't remember whether it's Norfolk or somewhere like that, but basically this is inspired by the East Anglian witch hunt of 1645 to 1647. It's dedicated to the many innocent women who lost their lives. And I really enjoyed this book. It actually meant quite a lot to me. Like, I find the subject of witches very fascinating anyway, because when you strip aside that title and what that word means to us in today's world, you know, you hear the word witch and you think of a old woman with green skin and a pointed nose and a hat and wearing a cape and having a broomstick and all of that. But actually what a witch was a woman who understood nature and, you know, was midwives and, you know, people just in touch with their emotions and with the elements and with nature, and the word witch was put on them to basically give them a excuse to murder them, basically. And so this story basically follows the main character, Martha, and she's a mute. There is something, she has a condition, something wrong with her throat, which makes it very difficult for her to talk. So she basically has made her own sign language, and she is the servant or maid or cook, whatever, within a household, but she has a master and she gets on with him so well. It's not like she's like a slave or anything like that. Like, she has worked with him for many years. She helped raise him as a baby and they have a really great relationship. But then a witch hunter comes to town, takes another woman who works in the house with Martha, takes loads of women from the town, and eventually ends up taking Martha too. And this is just a story of what happened to those women, where they were taken during the witch trials and the witch hunt, what happened to them, the torture that they went through, and yeah, inevitably what happened to them in the end. And it's a bit of a heart-wrenching story, because when you think that this actually happened to women, it's quite a hard read in places, but also it's a really beautifully written book. Because it is set in 1645, the language is a little bit old-fashioned and oldie-worldy at times, so in places it was a little bit hard to read, but I loved it so much. It made me feel so deeply for the characters, for the real women who went through these things. It meant a lot to me, and it was beautiful, and I think I would give it either a 4 or a 4.5 out of 5, and I would highly recommend. Okay, nearly there. So this is the book that I have just read, and I can't believe I've only just got to it. But it is, of course, A Court of Thorns and Roses, ACOTAR, by Sarah J. Maas, and this is another one that's been blowing up everywhere. This, The List, and Fourth Wing, I feel like, are three of the biggest books around at the moment. So A Court of Thorns and Roses, you've all probably read it, but it is a fantasy. It is a, in my head, it's like a mashup between Harry Potter, Hunger Games, a little bit of Twilight in there, and what else was it? There was something else. Oh, a little touch of Beauty and the Beast as well. And I really enjoyed this book. I bought the whole series before I'd even read one book, so I'm glad that I liked it, because I think, you know, everybody's been talking so highly of it. I was like, oh yeah, I'll obviously love that too, and thank God I did. So this book, for those few of you who haven't read it yet, follows the story of a girl called Feyre. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Feyre. But basically she goes, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I could be here talking about this for hours and hours, but Feyre goes into the woods one day. Her family are very poor, and she's basically solely in charge of gathering food for everybody. So she goes into the woods and she is about to kill a deer when she sees this massive, enormous wolf looking type thing, and she knows that if she doesn't kill it, it probably will kill her. So she shoots an arrow, and then it stares at her and it's not dead yet, and she shoots another without it doing anything. And it turns out that that wolf that she shot, the animal that she shot, was a high fae, which I know this probably means absolutely nothing if you haven't read it, but basically where they live, if you imagine Game of Thrones, where there is the wall that kind of divides, you know, north and south or whatever, mortals, humans have like the lower quarter, and the top 3/4 of the land belongs to the high fae. So they are people with magical abilities. They are people who can shape shift, and Feyre, as a punishment of what she has done, gets taken to live over the other side of the wall with a high fae called Tamlin, and his kind of sidekick, Lucian. And she is obviously at first distraught and scared and terrified. She doesn't know where she is. She's scared for her life. She's trying to protect herself and escape at all costs. But actually it turns out for the best, because Tamlin turns out to be the love of her life. And the story is about them breaking a curse, about the magical things in this land, and there's so much that I can't even go into. But for me, this was so enjoyable. This was a 4 out of 5, and I can't wait to read the rest of the series. Highly recommended. And just before I go, the last book, which I haven't read yet, but this is what I'm currently reading. This is Grady Hendrix, The Final Girls Support Group. You know how much I love the Southern Book Club book by him, so can't wait to read this book. I am 55 pages in. I've literally just started reading it. So far so good, so I will keep checking in about this. And yes, that is what I've read so far in 2024. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want any more information about any of the books, or like a more in-depth review about any of the books, then please let me know. Please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. I would love it if you would, comment or get in touch with me. Let me know what you thought about any of these books. And yes, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.